My business partner burnt my career to the ground and also tried to bury me alive under the ashes of my own reputation. But he forgot that I am the one who designed the furnace. My name is Julia Vane, and I am an architect of structures that were meant to outlast time. I stood in the center of the ballroom, a glass of champagne in my hand that I had no intention of drinking. Around me, the elite of the city whispered my name like a prayer. They thought they were witnessing the crowning of a queen. I knew I was standing in a room full of vultures waiting for the first scent of blood. Marcus Thorne, my partner and the man I once trusted with every secret of my trade, stood to my left. His hand rested on the small of my back, a gesture the world saw as supportive, but I felt for what it truly was, a measurement of my spine before the snap. Most people would have trembled if they knew what was coming. I didn't. I had spent years calculating stress loads and tension points. I knew exactly when a structure was about to fail. As the lights dimmed and the visionary award was announced, I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. My business partner had spent the last 6 months planting the seeds of my destruction, and tonight was the harvest. I didn't panic. I didn't show a single flicker of weakness. I simply adjusted my posture and waited for the floor to drop. The walk to the stage felt like a march to a scaffold, yet I glided. Every camera in the room followed the shimmer of my dress. I reached the podium and looked my partner directly in the eye. Marcus smiled back, the smile of a man who had already sold my soul to the highest bidder. When the announcer said my name, the applause was a thunderous lie. I took the trophy, a heavy glass shard that felt like a weapon, and prepared to speak. But the screen behind me didn't show my buildings. It showed my ruin. Forged bank logs, fake emails, and photos of shady deals scrolled past in high definition. The room went from a roar to a tomb-like silence. I could hear the mechanical whir of the cameras as they zoomed in, searching for a tear, a stagger, or a plea for mercy. I gave them nothing. I stood as still as the marble pillars I had designed, watching my life's work get dismantled in front of 300 people, while my partner watched with a predatory gleam in his eyes. "I think there has been a mistake," Marcus said, stepping into my light. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded rehearsed. My partner looked at the audience with a face full of fake pity. "Julia, I told you that cutting corners would catch up to us. I just didn't think you'd go this far." With those 2 sentences, the man I built an empire with handed the crowd the rope they needed to hang me. He shifted the blame of his own greed onto my shoulders, making me the villain of his story. I didn't scream. I didn't call him a liar. To do so would have been a sign of desperation, and I do not do desperate. I watched as security guards approached the stage, their faces hard. Marcus leaned in, pretending to offer a comforting word, but my partner whispered, "I'm taking the firm, Julia, and the city. You're just a ghost now." I didn't flinch. I let them lead me out through the service exit, past the trash and the rats. I walked with my head held high, already redesigning the world in my mind. A world where Marcus Thorne didn't exist. The clock on my wall ticked with a steady, heartless rhythm. 3:13 a.m. I sat in my dark kitchen, still wearing the gray silk gown, watching the news on a silent tablet. On the screen, the Vane Plaza stood like a giant of glass and steel. It was my masterpiece. It was also my partner's final evidence. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the screen flickered. A low, heavy boom vibrated through my floorboards, coming from miles away. On the live feed, the base of the plaza erupted in a cloud of gray dust. The lights inside the building blinked out. Then, a terrifying sound filled the air, the sound of steel screaming. The building didn't fall completely, but it groaned and tilted. The support beams, the ones Marcus had sabotaged while I was at the gala, snapped like dry twigs. Marcus had promised the city it was unsafe, and now he was proving it by destroying it himself. I didn't cry as I watched my life's work crumble. I watched the smoke rise and began to calculate. Marcus thought he was burying the truth, but he was actually giving me the perfect foundation for a ghost story. By sunrise, I was a wanted woman. The police were at my office, and the news anchors were calling me a murderer because of the guards trapped in the wreckage. I didn't wait for them to find me. I took the original blueprints, the real ones, hidden in a floor safe, and a single burner phone. I looked at the drawings one last time. Every architect has a final blueprint, the design they keep in their head for the perfect world. Mine was no longer a skyscraper or a school. My final blueprint was a trap. It was a house designed to be a mirror, reflecting every lie Marcus had ever told back at him until he couldn't breathe. I packed a small bag with the essentials, a dark wig, a pair of heavy boots, and my drafting tools. I left my keys on the table. Julia Vane was officially dead to the world. As I stepped out of the apartment and into the rain, I felt lighter. I didn't have a firm or a fortune anymore. I only had my mind, and that was the one thing my partner could never steal. The city is a forest of stone, and I knew every shadow. I didn't go to the airport or the train station. Instead, I walked to the industrial docks, a place of rust and salt where people don't ask for names. I bought a ticket on a cargo ship heading north under the name Elena Rossi. As the ship pulled away from the pier, I stood on the deck and watched the skyline shrink. I saw the empty space where the Vane Plaza used to stand. It looked like a missing tooth in a beautiful smile. Marcus would be there now, giving interviews, acting like a grieving hero. He thought he had won because I had vanished. He was wrong. I wasn't running away. I was going to ground. I needed time to let the world forget my face so I could return with a new one. I needed time to study the newest technology in acoustics and sensory deprivation. I watched the city lights disappear into the fog. "Enjoy your throne, Marcus," I whispered into the wind. "I'm going to build you a palace you'll never want to leave." For 5 years, I lived in the belly of the city, breathing in the scent of wet iron and sawdust. I traded my tailored suits for grease-stained coveralls and my name for a number on a time card. My partner, Marcus, was on every television screen in every diner I visited. He was the king of the skyline now, building glass towers on the bones of the legacy he stole from me. He thought I was a ghost, a piece of history that had been efficiently erased. I spent my nights in a rented garage, surrounded by acoustic panels and circuit boards. I didn't just want to build a house. I wanted to build a frequency. I studied how sound can bend a mind, how a low, vibrating hum can cause a human heart to race with unexplainable fear. Every penny I made as a freelance welder went into this research. My partner had taken my life, so I spent 5 years of dust and silence learning how to take his sanity. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. My long, dark hair was gone, replaced by a jagged, platinum blonde cut that looked like it was made of spun glass. I wore blue contact lenses that hid the fire in my eyes, making them look as cold as a winter lake. Julia Vane was a memory buried under the rubble of the plaza. In her place stood Lyra Thorne. I chose the name as a weapon. A thorn in his side, a constant reminder he wouldn't understand until it was too late. I began to leak my new designs onto the deep web, structures that looked like they belonged in a dream or a nightmare. I used smart glass and kinetic steel that seemed to move when you weren't looking. I knew how Marcus worked. He was a magpie. He couldn't resist a shiny, new genius. I was the bait, and I had crafted myself into a hook he was destined to swallow. To catch a man who lives in the light, you must become the master of the shadows. I hacked into the city's building registries and created a digital paper trail that led back to a prestigious, non-existent firm in Switzerland. I gave Lyra Thorne a history, a portfolio of masterpieces in remote corners of the world, and a reputation for being a recluse who only worked for the highest bidder. I wasn't just a person anymore. I was a brand he desperately wanted to own. I sat in my dark garage, watching a tracker I had placed on my new website. My heart didn't skip a beat when the IP address from Marcus Thorne's penthouse appeared. He spent 4 hours scrolling through my blueprints for the Carbon Fortress. I watched the cursor hover over the contact button. He was hooked. He thought he was discovering a new talent he could exploit, just like he had exploited me. He didn't realize that the ghost in the machine was already standing right behind him, holding the key to his future prison. The design for the Carbon Fortress was my masterpiece of deception. On the surface, it was a miracle of modern engineering, a sleek black structure made of reinforced carbon fiber, perched precariously on a cliffside over the Atlantic. It was designed to look indestructible, a symbol of ultimate power. To a man like my partner, it was the only home worthy of his status. It was the unbuildable house, and he was the only man with the money to try. But beneath the beautiful, dark skin of the building lay my true work. I had designed the floor plan to be a subtle labyrinth. Every hallway was slightly off parallel. Every ceiling was an inch lower than the last. It was a house designed to trigger infrasound. Vibrations so low the human ear can't hear them, but the human brain perceives them as a constant, haunting presence. I posted the final render online at midnight. By 6:00 a.m., my burner phone was vibrating with a private invitation. The fish had seen the bait. The meeting took place at a high-end, glass-walled restaurant overlooking the ruins of the Vane Plaza. I wore a sharp, charcoal suit and my blue lenses, my pulse as steady as a stone. When Marcus walked in, he looked older, his face tighter from too much stress and too much scotch. He didn't see Julia Vane, the woman he had crushed. He saw Lyra Thorne, the golden ticket to his next billion. "Ms. Thorne," he said, taking my hand. His skin was cold. "Your designs are aggressive, I like that." I didn't smile. Recluses don't smile. "The Carbon Fortress is not for everyone, Mr. Thorne. It requires a specific kind of strength to live in a house that breathes." He leaned back, a hungry look in his eyes. He spent the next hour trying to charm me, bragging about how he cleaned up the mess of his previous partner. He spoke about me as if I were a tragic mistake he had survived. I sat there, nodding, watching the man who stole my life offer me a check to build his coffin. The contract was 30 pages of legal traps, but I had written the most important parts in the fine print. Marcus was so eager to own the fortress that he didn't question the clause that gave me absolute control over the construction site. He didn't question the proprietary technology I insisted on installing: the sensors, the hidden speakers, and the air filtration systems. "To greatness," he said, signing his name in thick, arrogant ink. "To the truth," I replied, signing as Lyra Thorne. We shook hands, and for a moment the ghost of Julia Vane screamed inside me to wrap my fingers around his throat. But I silenced her. A quick death is a mercy, and I had promised him a slow, silent reckoning. As he walked away, I looked down at the signature. He had just signed away his fortune, his privacy, and his mind. The construction was about to begin, and for the first time in 5 years, I was the one holding the hammer. The cliffside was a jagged tooth of granite biting into the Atlantic Ocean. This was the site for the Carbon Fortress. Marcus stood at the edge, the wind whipping his expensive hair, looking out at the waves like he owned the sea itself. He held a golden shovel, the sun reflecting off the blade. When he drove it into the dirt, the cameras flashed. He was breaking ground on the most expensive private home in history. He didn't realize he was actually digging his own grave. I stood 5 feet behind him, wearing a hard hat and a reflective vest, my face hidden behind dark safety glasses. To the world, I was the brilliant Lyra Thorne, the architect of the future. To Marcus, I was just another tool he had bought. "It's a long way down, Mr. Thorne," I said as the wind howled. He laughed and told me that the higher the risk, the better the view. I watched the first excavator bite into the earth and thought about the 3 guards who died at the Vane Plaza. This ground wouldn't stay silent for long. Once the steel skeleton of the house was up, the real work began. While the construction crews installed the carbon fiber panels, I spent my nights alone in the structure, installing the nervous system. I hid ultra-thin, high-frequency speakers inside the wall cavities and the ventilation ducts. These weren't for music. I was programming the house with an acoustic signature, a collection of sounds designed to mimic the structural groans of a failing building. I tuned the house like an instrument. I set the master bedroom to vibrate at 19 Hz, a frequency known to cause feelings of intense sorrow and the sensation of being watched. I rigged the hallways to echo footsteps 3 seconds after someone had finished walking. Marcus wanted a house that was ahead of its time. I gave him a house that was alive. Every wire I pulled and every sensor I hid was a stitch in the shroud I was sewing for his sanity. The secret to a perfect trap is that the victim must feel safe inside it. I designed the subliminal foundations of the house to be visually stunning, but mentally exhausting. I used impossible geometry in the layout of the main hall. The angles were off by just half a degree, not enough for the eye to see, but enough for the inner ear to feel a constant sense of vertigo. I chose a specific shade of white for the walls that reflected light in a way that caused mild headaches over long periods. Marcus visited the site every week, walking through the unfinished rooms with a glass of scotch. "It feels powerful, Lyra," he said, touching the cold carbon walls. "It feels like nothing can touch me here." I watched him stand in the center of the living room, exactly where the 19 Hz frequency was strongest. He shivered just for a second and rubbed his arms. He blamed it on the ocean breeze. I smiled behind my mask. The house was already starting to talk to him, and he was already starting to listen. The heart of the carbon fortress was a room Marcus called his war room, but on the blueprints, I labeled it the inner sanctum. It was a windowless box suspended in the center of the structure, held up by tension cables that I had personally tuned. To him, it was a soundproof vault where he could handle his shadiest business deals in total privacy. To me, it was a resonance chamber. I lined the walls with a specialized, smart alloy that looked like polished obsidian, but acted as a giant microphone. Every whisper Marcus uttered in that room was recorded and fed into a server I controlled from my basement across town. I watched him on hidden, pinhole cameras as he sat at his desk, laughing about how he had fooled the city and outplayed his dead partner. He felt invincible inside those black walls. He didn't realize that the very room he used to hide his secrets was designed to broadcast them to me in high definition. By the 4th month of construction, the house began to breathe. I installed a high-tech climate control system that didn't just move air. It changed the atmospheric pressure in different rooms at random intervals. If Marcus stayed in the library too long, the pressure would drop, making him feel tired and heavy. If he moved to the dining room, it would spike, making his ears pop and his pulse quicken. I also programmed the carbon panels to expand and contract ever so slightly using hidden thermal coils. Late at night, the house would emit a soft, rhythmic thump-thump sound, like a giant heart beating beneath the floorboards. Marcus began to complain about settling noises, but I told him it was just the carbon fiber adjusting to the ocean temperature. He believed me. He wanted the house to be alive so badly that he didn't notice it was trying to suffocate him. The master bathroom was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. I tiled it entirely in one-way, smart glass. To Marcus, it looked like a room of perfect, infinite mirrors. He loved seeing his own reflection from every angle. It fed the ego that had destroyed my life. But the mirrors were actually screens. With a single command, I could make the reflections lag by half a second. I started small. He would brush his teeth, and his reflection would stop a fraction of a second after he did. He would blink, and his reflection's eyes would stay open for an extra heartbeat. I watched through the cameras as he stopped, squinted at the glass, and rubbed his eyes. He thought he was tired. He thought he was working too hard. He didn't know that I was slowly untethering his brain from reality, one reflection at a time. The house was no longer a building. It was a ghost of me, standing right in front of him, waiting for him to notice the crack in the glass. The construction was almost finished, but the workers were starting to quit. They talked about tools moving on their own and the sound of a woman humming in the ventilation shafts. I made sure these glitches happened when I wasn't around, so my partner would think it was just the stress of the project. I moved through the house at night like a shadow, leaving small things behind. A single drafting pencil on Marcus's desk, or a coffee cup stained with the specific shade of lipstick Julia Vane used to wear. One night, Marcus caught a glimpse of me in the reflection of a dark window. I was wearing my old work jacket, the one with the Vane Architecture logo on the back. By the time he turned around, I was gone, slipped through a hidden panel in the wall. He stood in the empty room, his breathing heavy and fast. He was starting to look over his shoulder. My partner had spent 5 years forgetting me, but the construction ghost was making sure I was the only thing he could think about. The day of the final inspection arrived. Marcus walked through the house with a team of city officials, looking like the king of the world again. He had regained some of his confidence, convinced that the strange things he'd seen were just his imagination. He showed off the carbon fortress as the safest, most advanced building on Earth. I walked behind the group, silent and professional, carrying the digital tablet that controlled every nerve in the house. As we stood in the grand foyer, I tapped a command on my screen. A tiny, almost invisible crack appeared in the smart glass ceiling. It made a sound like a gunshot. Everyone jumped, but Marcus laughed it off, calling it thermal expansion. I looked him in the eye and saw the lie hiding in his pupils. He was terrified. He knew that sound. It was the same sound the Vane Plaza made at 3:14 a.m. The inspection passed, but the house had already failed the only test that mattered. the one inside his head. The massacre wasn't a physical one. It was a slaughter of Marcus's public image. He invited the city's elite, the same vultures who had watched my public execution 5 years ago, to a grand housewarming gala. The champagne flowed, and the music was loud, but I had prepared a special playlist. I mixed the music with the exact frequencies of the Vane Plaza's collapse. As Marcus stood on the grand staircase to give his speech, I activated the house's stress protocol. The lights began to flicker in a coded rhythm. The high-end sound system didn't just play music. It started broadcasting the screams of the wind from the night the plaza fell. Guests began to feel sick, clutching their heads as the infrasound kicked in. Marcus tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of grinding metal coming from the walls. His perfect evening turned into a panicked exit as his guests fled the haunted fortress, leaving him standing alone in the dark, screaming at walls that refused to be silent. The guests were gone, and the heavy, carbon fiber front door clicked shut with a sound like a tomb closing. Marcus stood in the center of the foyer, his expensive tuxedo stained with spilled wine. He shouted for his staff, but I had already sent them home with a digital memo from his own account. For the first time, he was truly alone in the house I had built for him. I tapped a button on my tablet, activating the 0 decibel protocol. Every vent closed. Every hum of the refrigerator died. The house became so quiet that the silence felt like a physical weight pressing against his eardrums. In a normal room, there is always a background noise. The wind, a distant car, the buzz of a light bulb. Here, there was nothing. Marcus began to pace, but his footsteps sounded like explosions in the void. He was finally learning that silence isn't peace, it's a mirror. By 2:00 a.m., Marcus was sitting on the floor of his master bedroom. Without any outside noise to distract him, his brain began to focus on the only sounds left, the rush of blood in his veins and the steady thump-thump of his own heart. I adjusted the room's acoustics to amplify those internal sounds. To him, it sounded like a giant drum was beating inside the walls. He started talking to himself just to break the quiet, but I had designed the walls to absorb his voice instantly. No echo, no reflection. It was as if his words were being swallowed by the darkness the moment they left his mouth. He began to claw at his ears, convinced that something was crawling inside them. I watched him through the pinhole camera, my face illuminated by the cold blue light of my screen. He had stolen my voice 5 years ago. Now, I was letting him listen to his own fear. Marcus decided to leave. He stumbled toward the hallway, reaching for the handle of the bedroom door. But I had installed flush-mount, motorized panels covered in the same carbon material as the walls. As he reached out, the door slid perfectly into the wall, and a new panel slid into its place. There was no handle. There was no seam. It looked like a solid, unbroken wall. He spun around, looking for the bathroom door. Click. It vanished too. He ran his hands along the surface, screaming for help, but the material was cold and smooth. I manipulated the lighting to create shadows that made the hallway look miles long, then seconds later, made the walls look like they were leaning in to crush him. He was a rat in a maze of his own making, and every time he thought he found an exit, I simply redesigned the room. The architect was in control now, and the visionary was just a prisoner looking for a way out. Marcus stopped screaming when he realized the house wasn't just quiet, it was hungry. I activated the total dark mode. The smart glass windows turned as black as obsidian, cutting off the moonlight and the stars. He couldn't see his own hands. In sensory deprivation, the brain starts to manufacture its own reality. It creates phantoms to fill the void. I let him sit in the pitch black for hours. Then I played a sound. It wasn't a loud sound. It was the soft, metallic clink of a drafting pen hitting a glass table. It was the sound I used to make every night when we were partners. Marcus whimpered in the dark. "Julia," he whispered. I didn't answer. I just let the silence stretch until he began to see my face in the shadows of his own mind. He was no longer a billionaire. He was a terrified child lost in a forest of carbon fiber. While Marcus was trapped inside the house, I was destroying his empire outside of it. I used the backdoor access he gave me to his accounts to trigger a series of automated trades. I funneled his fortune into the maintenance of the carbon fortress. Every hour he spent in that house, $1 million disappeared into offshore accounts he could never trace. I leaked reports to the press about Marcus Thorne's mental breakdown. I sent out his private emails, the real ones this time, showing how he had bribed city officials to pass the inspection for the fortress. By noon, his stock price was falling faster than the Vane Plaza. He had built his wealth on a foundation of air, and I was simply letting the air out. By the time he walked out of that house, if he ever did, he wouldn't even own the shoes on his feet. I decided to give him back the light, but I made it a weapon. I programmed the LED panels in the walls to strobe at a specific frequency that causes the paranoia effect. It makes the edges of your vision blur and makes you feel like someone is standing just behind your shoulder. Marcus began to run from room to room, but the paranoia partition followed him. He found a kitchen knife, clutching it as he swung at the empty air. "I know you're here," he roared. I watched him through the camera in the ceiling. His eyes were bloodshot and his expensive shirt was torn. He was a man who had everything, and now he was a man who was afraid of his own shadow. I turned the walls a deep blood red and whispered a single word through the hidden speakers. "Guilty." He dropped the knife and fell to his knees, finally broken. Marcus was crawling on the floor, his fingers bleeding from trying to find a seam in the walls. He accidentally hit a pressure plate I had hidden behind a baseboard. Suddenly, a section of the hallway didn't just slide, it rotated. A blast of cold, stale air hit him. Beyond the opening was a wing of the house he had never seen on the official plans. He stumbled inside, the lights flickering on with a harsh, surgical white glow. The walls weren't black carbon here, they were covered in floor-to-ceiling photographs. Every photo was of the Vane Plaza collapse. There were close-ups of the twisted steel, the dust-covered streets, and the faces of the 3 guards he had murdered. In the center of the room sat a single, dusty drafting table, my old table from our original office. Marcus gasped, his knees hitting the floor. He realized then that this house wasn't built by a stranger. It was a museum of his sins. On the drafting table lay a single object, a gold compass, the same one I had used to design our first project together. Beside it was a small digital tablet with one button on the screen, the truth. Marcus reached out for it, his hand shaking so hard he almost dropped the device. He thought it was his way out. He thought it was the master key to unlock the doors and let him back into the world. But as soon as he touched the screen, the tablet began to play a video. It wasn't a movie. It was a live feed of his own office from 5 years ago. I had recovered the deleted security footage he thought he had destroyed. The video showed Marcus planting the bribe emails on my computer and talking to the demolition team about 3:14 a.m. He watched his own face on the screen, younger and full of arrogance. He reached for the tablet to smash it, but a voice boomed from the walls, my voice, Julia's voice. "That's not the exit, Marcus. That's the evidence." "Julia, I know you're alive," Marcus screamed at the ceiling. "Let me out, I'll give you everything. The money, the towers, the name, it's all yours." I didn't answer with words. I answered with the 0-decibel protocol. I tapped the final command on my control board. Every single door in the carbon fortress, the hidden ones, the glass ones, the steel ones, slid shut and locked with a magnetic thud that vibrated through the entire cliffside. The air filtration system slowed down until it was just a faint whisper. The house was now a sealed vacuum. No sound from the ocean could get in. No scream from Marcus could get out. He was at the center of a black box, miles from the nearest human being, trapped in a room full of pictures of the people he had killed. He was finally in a place as empty and cold as his own heart. The lights in the hidden wing shifted from surgical white to a deep, interrogational blue. In the center of the room, the drafting table began to glow. A small, high-definition microphone rose from a hidden slot in the wood. Marcus stared at it like it was a loaded gun. "The air in this house is recycled, Marcus," my voice echoed, but it didn't sound like it came from the speakers. It sounded like it was coming from inside his own head. "I have enough oxygen in the tanks for 48 hours, or I can open the doors right now. All you have to do is tell the truth to the little black box." Marcus began to weep, not from regret, but from the sheer exhaustion of being hunted by a ghost. He looked at the photographs of the Vane Plaza on the walls. He looked at the 3 guards he had erased from existence. He knew the house was recording everything. He knew that the moment he spoke, his life was over. But as the silence of the 0 decibel protocol pressed against his brain, the truth became the only way to breathe. Marcus finally broke. He leaned into the microphone, his voice a ragged whisper that grew into a sob. He confessed to everything. He detailed the forged emails, the bribes, and the specific explosives used at 3:14 a.m. He admitted that he didn't just want the money. He wanted to be the only visionary left standing. He confessed until there were no lies left to tell. Suddenly, the wall in front of him flickered and turned transparent. It wasn't a wall at all. It was two-way glass. On the other side sat a woman in a slate-gray suit, her hair short and jagged, her eyes a warm, natural brown. I took off the blue contact lenses and let them drop to the floor. I didn't say a word. I just watched him. The look on his face when he realized that Lyra Thorne was the woman he had murdered 5 years ago was better than any award I had ever won. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the architect, and I was watching my final design reach completion. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice cold and clear. The world was listening. I tapped a final icon on my tablet. I didn't just record his confession. I had live-streamed it. Because I had spent 5 years building a reclusive genius brand for Lyra Thorne, millions of people were already watching the housewarming stream. The confession didn't just go to the police. It went to every news station, every social media feed, and every digital billboard in the city. The stock market for Thorne Industries flatlined in seconds. Outside the gates of the Carbon Fortress, the sirens of 100 police cars began to wail. Marcus threw himself against the glass, screaming my name, but the soundproofing was perfect. He couldn't hear the world ending for him, and the world couldn't hear him begging for mercy. He was the most famous man on earth for all the wrong reasons. I stood up, walked away from the glass, and left him in the blue light of his own ruin. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers reflected off the black carbon walls of the fortress. I didn't wait for them to reach the front gate. I had designed a service tunnel that led from the hidden wing directly to a small, private cove at the base of the cliff. While Marcus was still screaming at the two-way glass, I was already moving through the cool, damp dark of the tunnel. I stripped off the charcoal suit and the jagged blonde wig, revealing the simple black clothes I wore underneath. I left the Lyra Thorne identity on the floor of that tunnel like a snake shedding its skin. At the end of the path, a small boat was waiting, bobbed by the tide. I looked up at the fortress one last time. It sat on the cliff like a dark crown. Inside, the man who had stolen my life was finally facing the architect of his own. I pushed the boat into the water and let the current take me into the fog. The trial was short. Marcus Thorne's own voice, recorded in high definition by the house he had paid for, was impossible to fight. He was sentenced to life in a maximum security prison, a place of concrete and iron that, ironically, he had helped fund years ago. The world moved on, but they didn't forget the name Julia Vane. My name was cleared, the Visionary Award was returned to my empty office, and the Vane Plaza site was turned into a memorial park. I didn't return to the spotlight. I moved to a quiet city where the buildings are old and have nothing to hide. I opened a small firm under a name no one knows. Sometimes, I sit in the park and listen to the sound of the wind moving through the trees. People think architecture is about the height of the walls or the shine of the glass. They are wrong. Real architecture is about the truth of the space between the walls. Marcus Thorne is living in a cell now, listening to the silence. And I am finally building something that doesn't need a cage. I am building a life.